Hey everyone, today we're going to continue on with the cardiovascular system. The first major section was about the heart's anatomy, how blood is pumped throughout the heart, and other physiological things such as cardiac output, stroke volume, and how a signal is sent. This section, we're going to really focus on the blood vessels. So once the heart pumps the blood, where does it go? Blood is actually contained in blood vessels and it forms something called a closed vascular system. We call it a closed system because the blood is contained within blood vessels and not just all throughout our body. These blood vessels transport blood to the tissues and then back to the heart. They are also responsible for transporting blood to the lungs and then, of course, back to the lungs as well. There are basically three major categories of blood vessels that we're going to talk about. The first one is vessels that carry blood away from the heart. We call these arteries, and then arterioles are just smaller arteries. The second type of blood vessel are going to be the ones that play a role in exchanging gases between the tissues and the blood. And this occurs at something called capillary beds or capillaries. Capillaries are very, very, very tiny blood vessels, and they are usually only one cell thick in order to allow diffusion of these gases across the membrane. The third major type is going to be vessels that return blood towards the heart, and we call these venules and then eventually veins. So again, the order that they usually go is arteries, which are big blood vessels, arterioles gets a little bit smaller, capillary beds are very tiny and thin, venules are a little bit bigger than capillary beds, and then veins widen even more. The second thing we kind of have to talk about is color. Now, your notes indicates red versus blue when we talked about the heart. And color is actually often used to depict the level of oxygen in blood. Again, just like in the heart, red typically indicates oxygen-rich blood. These are often going to be your arteries and arterioles because they are carrying blood away from your heart to the rest of your body in order to get oxygenated. Blue is going to typically indicate oxygen-poor blood, and these are usually veins and venules. There are exceptions, and these exceptions you have actually already learned when you were looking at the heart. The exception is pulmonary arteries and veins. Pulmonary arteries in the pulmonary trunk are actually oxygen poor because they haven't got to the lungs yet, where they are going to pick up oxygen. And then the pulmonary veins are oxygen rich because they are bringing that oxygenated blood from the lungs back to the heart. And so there's this really cool phrase called arteries are red, veins are blue, but for the lungs, there's an exception of two, again, which are the pulmonary arteries and veins. Now, I do want to just specify that it says colors used to depict oxygen levels. That does not mean your oxygen poor blood is blue. Actually, your oxygen poor blood is actually a very deep, deep dark red. And then a brighter red is typically going to be oxygen rich blood. So again, blue is not really the color of your blood. It's just used to indicate that it is low on oxygen. Besides talking about these blood vessels, we're going to also talk about the anatomy of these blood vessels. And there are actually three layers, and we call these layers tunics of blood vessels. Typically, arteries and veins are going to contain all three of these layers. Capillaries typically only contain one of the layers. So let's talk about all three. The first one says tunica intima. This is going to be interior part of the blood vessel. And this is where, again, it's going to form a friction reducing lining. Because you have all this blood going through your blood vessels, it's going to rub along that lining. And we want this to be very thick and be made up of squamous epithelial cells that are easily regenerated. The middle layer we call tunica media. Think of medium, middle. This is going to be composed of smooth muscles and elastic tissue. We want smooth muscles in order to make sure that our blood is pumping all throughout, and then elastic tissue because this blood needs to be under high pressure to pump far enough. We need those blood vessels to be able to expand and contract. Typically, these are controlled by your sympathetic nervous system because they are the ones that change the diameter of your blood vessels. If you forgot, sympathetic is typically your fight or flight system. And the last one, tunica externa, think of external. This is going to be the outermost covering. It is very fibrous, it's made up of connective tissue, and it's going to provide the main support and protection of the blood vessel. So here is a picture of the blood vessel and the layers, an artery versus a vein. And one thing I really want you to understand right now is arteries. You're going to see that their structure is a lot thicker than veins. And we're going to talk about that here in a little bit. Here is a drawing that comes from your book that kind of shows the three layers. We have tunica intima. Again, it's the most inside layer. We have tunica media, again made up of smooth muscle, and then tunica externa, which is going to be the outermost layer. The other thing that I kind of want to point out is that we're going to bring this picture back to kind of show you the differences between arteries, capillaries, and veins. Speaking of these structural differences, one thing to note is that arteries are going to have heavier, stronger, and stretchier tunica medias than veins will. And that's because arteries are under a very, very, very high pressure. If we actually go back to this picture, again, here is your tunica media. Notice the thickness in an artery versus the thickness over here on the vein. Arteries, again, are a lot thicker because of the pressure that they are under. Veins, on the other hand, are going to have thinner tunica media than arteries, and that's because they tend to operate under lower pressure. However, blood still needs to go from our feet all the way back to our heart, so veins are very special because they have something called valves, and valves, just like the function in the heart, is to prevent backflow of blood. We don't want our blood to pool at the very bottom of our feet. The other thing that veins have is they have a lumen of veins that are often larger than that of arteries. And also, veins are often going to be around a lot of muscles or skeletal muscles that contract and relax in order to milk or squeeze that blood in the veins back towards the heart. Also, what helps get blood back to our heart in the veins is our respiratory pumps, and breathing helps as well. So here is what I mean. We have veins. We want blood to flow up. So blood's going to flow up through this valve. This valve's going to close so the blood cannot flow back down. Skeletal muscle will contract to help keep pushing this blood up. It'll go up through this valve. Once it gets in this area, this valve will close, and it'll keep working its way back up to the heart. The last structural difference in terms of arteries, veins, and capillaries is capillaries. These blood vessels do not contain all three types. They do not have a tunica externa and intima, or does not have tunica externa and media. They are actually only one cell layer thick in order to allow for exchange of oxygen and CO2 between blood and tissues, and so they are only made up of the innermost layer, which is tunica intima. Capillaries are also blood vessels that tend to form a lot of networks called capillary beds, and these capillary beds consist of two parts. The first part is called a vascular shunt, and the last part is true capillaries. Now, we are actually going to bring up a picture of this, but to define it, a vascular shunt is going to directly connect arterioles to venules on the opposite side of the bed. And true capillaries are going to be my exchange vessels, where a lot of my CO is picked up and a lot of my O2 is dropped off. One thing to do know is that blood circulation within capillary beds, we call this microcirculation. Micro just meaning very tiny, and capillary beds are extremely tiny blood vessels. So I'm actually going to come back to this slide, and I'm going to talk about the vascular shunt versus true capillaries. Vascular shunt, this is going to be a capillary bed, and vascular shunt is this going to be from here, runs all the way to the very end. So this major capillary is your vascular shunt. All of these other capillaries that branch off of it, these are called true capillaries. So to talk about these vascular shunt versus true capillaries, let's talk about it. True capillaries, once we should know that they branch off of the proximal end of the shunt. Proximal means closest, and they return at the distal. And to give you a little bit more contextual context for that is they're going to branch off the terminal arteriole. So over here, I have a terminal arteriole, means the last of the arterial blood vessels that are taking blood away from the heart. It's going to branch off right here. Then it says it's going to empty into the postcapillary venule. So if we go back up to that picture, you're going to see that here I have my postcapillary because it's after my capillary beds, and it's a venule. So this is, again, a blood vessel that's going to take blood back to the heart. The other thing to note is that entrances of capillary beds are guarded by something called precapillary sphincters. Sphincters, the whole function of them is to regulate the flow of blood into the capillary. So if I bring up this picture, these knots right here are going to be your sphincters. Again, they're labeled. Sphincters can open and close, so shut off and open based on, do I need blood flow to that particular set of tissues. So whenever the sphincter is open, blood is going to flow through the true capillaries and take part in cell exchange. This typically happens if that kind of tissue needs a lot of oxygen, such as your muscles when you're running. And then sometimes the sphincter may close in order to regulate where is the blood and oxygen going, and it bypasses these tissue cells. So typically, sometimes sphincters will close in your digestive organs when you're in your fight or flight response, because we're going to divert that blood from our liver over to our skeletal muscles. So again, here is where our sphincters are open. You can see blood flowing all throughout it. We have oxygenated blood coming in. The purple is showing where the exchange is occurring, and blue is now that it's oxygen poor, it's going to go to this venule. If the sphincters were closed because it needed to divert blood, here you're going to see it's going to close the sphincter. My blood's going to go down the vascular shunt. It's just not going to go into the true capillaries. And that's the end of today's lesson before we talk about major arteries within the body. If you have any questions, please ask. And otherwise I hope you guys have a great day.